this second part of the makeup lecture, we'll continue our discussion of Renaissance Italy. We had been looking at Michelangelo and Raphael in Florence, working at pretty much the same time in Florence. Leonardo was there as well. And then how both of them had been summoned by Pope Julius II to work in the city of Rome as well, again working in close proximity at the exact same time. This part of the makeup lecture will look at the city of Venice. So Florence is sort of here. Sorry about that. Florence is sort of here. Rome is here, right? And as you can see, I've circled Venice on the map. The Renaissance in Venice presents a very different sort of situation. The reason I have this Google map here is to show you that the city of Venice, which is here, is in fact a man-made island dating to the 7th century inside of a lagoon. It was a series of smaller islands that were linked together by construction. And because it's a relatively new city, 7th century AD, it doesn't have any ancient Roman ruins within the city. There's no Roman art waiting to be reborn in the countryside around it, unlike most of the rest of Italy. That said, they did have access to Roman literature. And when we talk about the Renaissance in Venice, one of the things we see is that the influence of ancient literature is far more important for Renaissance painting in Venice than ancient Roman art, sculpture, architecture. One of the things that Venetian painters do is turn to ancient Roman poetry about a place called Arcadia. This is an unspoiled bit of landscape where time has stood still, where urban development hasn't changed a thing, where people lead simpler lives, more in tune with nature. The other term we use to refer to this type of poetry is pastoral poetry. Pastor coming from the term for shepherds, that often in the poems and in the Venetian paintings that seem inspired by them, we have a focus on shepherds. So we see this rural scenery unspoiled by progress. This is influenced on the one hand by Roman poetry that our Venetian painters are looking at, but it's also inspired, I think, very much by the fact that Venice is a city, entirely urban and entirely man-made and without a countryside. And so the land, the mainland, presented a particular appeal to Venetian painters. And we see landscape takes a stronger role here than anywhere else. Look how much landscape is, simple landscape, takes up this particular composition. You'll notice as we look at the composition, the Holy Family is off to the right, and they've been placed well off to the right. Christ is even well off-center, and the figures that occupy the center of the composition, the figures that dominate the composition, are indeed the shepherds. That is what pastoral means, of shepherds, of the pastors. They are the main focus of this image. They are the center of it. And most of the painting, a good half of the painting or more, is given over to their world, their landscape. A landscape with other shepherds scattered about through it. You can see a little fellow on the left seated in a hut. You can see a few more back here. By the tree, there are even tinier figures on the side of the seashore. Here, everywhere we look is a landscape that is characterized by shepherds. This is a pastoral landscape. Now, if we look at detail of the pair in the back, and in fact that's the hind end of a little sheep just here. Sorry about the detail cutting it off. They are looking up into the sky and gesturing. And if you follow the direction of their gaze, they are looking to the upper left corner of the composition. And if we follow that direction, we find that there's an angel there coming down, announcing to them that Christ has been born. This is exactly what we saw in Duccio's composition toward the beginning of this class, where the angel informs the shepherds that Christ has been born. And in the foreground, we see two other shepherds who have already heard this news and have made their way forward. Now, what's fascinating is if you look at that angel in the corner, you'll notice that the tree is lit by the angel itself. This tree here is in fact illuminated by the light coming from the angel, because the natural light is behind it, and the natural light falls on those buildings back there, but it is on the other side of that tree. So the light that we're seeing closest to us is in fact supernatural light. And the more you realize that the light is coming from the angel, you start to see this pool of light that's falling directly on Christ, on the Virgin Mary, Joseph, a little bit more in the shadow, on the backs of those shepherds, but is illuminating the exact thing that the shepherds are looking at. So what we're seeing here is the moment when the shepherds have seen Christ, have been converted, and they're learning holy ways. Their gestures, their body poses, mirror that of the Holy Family. They are all trying their best to do the right thing, to do honor to Christ. And light plays a crucial role in this. It's what's led the shepherds to the manger, to the Holy Family. And that light is the theme that plays throughout the rest of the composition. Here you can see a couple more figures by the side of the seashore, engaged in some sort of exchange, which happens a lot in pastoral poetry. But in the background we see the effects of urbanism, if you will. It's almost as if this is an environmentalist picture, because the city itself is somewhat destroyed. You'll look at the roof of that tower, for example, and you can see that the city is in need of repair. But this is the city where the natural light of the sun, the setting sun, is falling, not on the Holy Family. That's holy light falling on them. And so we have this juxtaposition between the light of spirituality and the light of the world, the light of nature, and how one is superseding the other. And I think that's something we've seen quite a bit in painting, but I think it's an important part of how this picture functions. And I think that Giorgione knows this. He paints a little torch inside that archway in those buildings. Again, this idea that natural light will be superseded by the holy light of spirituality. We saw that in Robert Campin's Marot altarpiece as well. It's a theme well known to Renaissance painters. Giorgione is particularly interested in these pastoral landscapes, these poetic landscapes that suggest things often without really tying them down. Although the more I study these, the more I realize that the meaning is fairly straightforward. But here again we have the idea of a pastoral landscape. Not as many shepherds here, in fact, few to see at all, but this idea of a bucolic rural landscape shielded away from the city in the background, a city that is in fact in disrepair. And we're seeing the place where we leave one behind and enter into the other realm. It's harder to say what the figures are actually doing in this one. It is not a religious scene by any means. The title, The Tempest means storm, and this is a title that's been given to the picture by later collectors, not by Giorgione himself, but it refers to that gathering dark cloud and the bolt of lightning that we see in the background. Now, this bolt of lightning may relate to what we're seeing in the foreground in one way or another. It suggests tension. It suggests conflict. Storms do. And so it may have everything to do with what we see in the rest of the picture. What's often mentioned in regards to that storm is a certain erotic tension. In the foreground, we have a man at the left who's looking at a half-naked woman on the right. Her nudity is certainly part of the subject matter, even though she's suckling a child, which makes it seem somewhat innocent. The way in which she holds the child behind her other thigh, not on her lap, exposes her nudity not only to the viewer who's in front of her on a certain level, but also to you, the viewer of the picture. And so she's sort of we're meant to gawk and ogle, to look at her. And in a certain level, it's almost as if she's showing herself to us. The fact that this might be a picture that's about erotic arousal is picked up by some of the details around the fellow in the left corner. He holds on to that long, erect stick, and there are those two half columns that grow behind him. All of these are phallic elements that suggest that maybe his gaze is one of eroticism. So that's one way in which we can certainly interpret this picture. Another way to interpret the picture is about the meeting between two worlds. The meeting between the urban world, which is imperfect, and a more perfect rural world, where these worlds are in fact colliding. Now, the fellow that we see in the left corner wears a contemporary Venetian costume, and it helps us to identify him as part of a particular group. There was an acting troupe. They performed music, they performed theatrical pieces, and they were called the Company of the Stocking, and they were known by their multicolored, mismatched leggings that they wore, which is exactly what he's wearing. So he's a member of a dramatic troupe, and he's certainly meant to be seen as a member of contemporary Venetian society. And he has come from the city that we see in the background out into the countryside. This idea of traveling from city to country is picked up by the landscape details in the background. Moving from that ruined building, we see a bridge with a figure crossing the bridge. You can barely see her here. And that bridge then culminates in a path that leads down toward the foreground. That in fact leads right toward where our Venetian gentleman is standing. So we are meant, I think, to believe that he has crossed that bridge already, followed that path into the foreground, and there he has encountered this woman. He is a representative of the city, moving into the countryside. We can also then think about the fact that the half wall and the columns directly behind him are also part of that encroachment. The city sprawling into the countryside, and they are part of who he is. Something that maybe doesn't belong there, that has moved out of the city and should have stayed there in the first place. If we read it like that he is a symbol of urban sprawl, of the urban world encroaching on nature, then that means that she must be nature itself. Since she's nursing and since she is naked, unadorned, she is pure, she is closer to nature. Nature nurtures us all. And so what he's seeing here, and maybe even what he's being aroused by, is not necessarily only sexuality, but rather by the nurturing power of nature itself. He has gone for a stroll in the countryside, which is the theme of many of these Arcadian pastoral poems. Going to the rural, perfect world where time has stood still, to take in nature, to be inspired. So there's a sort of a dual meaning here, isn't there? On the one hand, the bald eroticism of the gaze, and on the other hand, something that relates back to Venetian poems, Venetian pastoral poems, about finding inspiration in nature. Also in Venice is an artist who takes up this same idea of Arcadian landscape themes. Probably the single greatest artist of Renaissance Venice, Titian, who studied under Giorgione. He was Giorgione's pupil before Giorgione died prematurely in 1510. So Titian's Pastoral Symphony on the left has often been attributed to Giorgione, and probably dates from right around the time that Giorgione died, right around 1510. And It again is an Arcadian landscape that's derived from Venetian poems about pastoral life that themselves were inspired by ancient Roman poems of the same. In the lower right corner, we see a shepherd more prominently placed in Titian's picture with his flock moving through the landscape. So it is, in fact, very much an Arcadian pastoral landscape. And just like the Tempest, we have a man from the city, another member of the company of the Stockings, who has gone out to the pastoral countryside for inspiration, right, to see the world outside. And there he encounters amazing things that inspire him. Now, in this particular case, our professional musician, the man in red with the multicolored stockings, is playing music for a second shepherd. There's one in the background and one seated on the hill. You can see his bare foot out behind the nude woman on the right. We know it's a shepherd based on how he's dressed, but over and above that, shepherds were often associated with music. And if we go all the way back to Duccio, where we see the angel appearing to the shepherds in the lower right corner, we see them with their flock. And we also see that they carry bagpipes. And this is a long-standing medieval and Renaissance tradition for shepherds, that they in fact were musicians as well, that this is how they whiled away the time with their flocks on the hills in the countryside. So shepherds and music go hand in hand, and Titian is tying into that particular tradition. So our professional musician from the city has gone out to the countryside, seen a shepherd that is also associated with music, and one wonders then if our boy from the city has learned a song from the shepherds, or is he teaching them a different kind of song, teaching them an urban song to these rural musicians. This is a question that Titian doesn't answer, really. But the naked woman that's standing there, or sitting there with a pipe, is certainly meant to be the personification of music itself. She's not really there seated with them, but rather music given human form. She's the music that they hear. She's the inspiration for the musician, one wonders, or perhaps the effects of his song on the shepherd. If it's the latter, if in fact this woman with the pipe indicates the effect that the shepherd's or the musician's song has, then it gives it, again, a very, very strong erotic overtone. If you look at the proximity of the heads of the two figures, the shepherd and the musician, and the gaze of the shepherd longingly into the face, or of the musician longingly into the face of the shepherd, some have argued the gaze of the shepherd down behind to whatever's beneath that lute that he's playing. There's a strong erotic overtone to this. And if you look at where the pipe of the woman is placed, you can imagine then that it too is a very strongly phallic symbol. So just like Giorgione before him, Titian is layering meanings here. On the one hand, the simple idea of going out for inspiration to the countryside, and seeing allegorical figures, personifications there for that inspiration, but then layering that with really strong erotic content. The fact that she's inspiration, however, is certainly driven home by the other naked figure, who's either removing water from or pouring water into a well. Either way, the idea of a well is a strong link to inspiration. And so certainly that idea of inspiration, however we decide to read its overtones, is the theme that Titian is working with here. Titian had a very, very long career, that's all the way to the 1570s or so. And here, some 30 years later, we see him still working with images of nude women as inspiration. The Roman goddess of love, Venus, but she's been updated into a stylish 16th century Italian bedroom. This is based on an image from his teacher Giorgione, who we looked at before, an image of the sleeping Venus that Giorgione had done prior to his death. Titian knew this work because he had studied under Giorgione, and it's quite obvious that the body of Titian's Venus is deeply indebted to Giorgione's work, even though it's 30 years after Giorgione painted it. Now, the theme of the reclining Venus in an interior is a theme that Titian painted a number of different occasions for different patrons. And this one picks up the idea of the nude woman as inspiration. She has a flute in her hands, Venus does. She's being crowned by a little Cupid figure in the background, but she is definitely inspiring through love our lute player on the left, with his phallic sword off to the side. This is sort of an amalgam of the two scenes, the Venus of Urbino on one hand, and the Pastoral Symphony that we just saw on the other. Now, while it seems that she's Venus, and that's the name that she's come to acquire, many people think that it's actually an illustration of a prostitute, a contemporary illustration of a prostitute. So it's a scene of everyday life. And if you look at the placement of the hand, some have even suggested that she's perhaps masturbating, the way her fingers go in to touch herself. If you look at each of her two hands, you'll notice that they're in very, very similar positions, and one of them is fiddling with the flower, breaking apart the bouquet, and the other one's fiddling in its own way. This idea that she's up to no good, if you will, was picked up by no less than Mark Twain when he saw this picture on traveling through Italy. He said it was the foulest, the vilest, the obscenest picture that the world possesses. And I think he's actually reacting to that idea of what she's doing with her left hand. Regardless of what she's doing, the picture's obviously meant to be erotic. It's a nude that's been posed for you, the viewer, which is exactly what we saw Giorgione doing in the Tempest picture as well. Her nudity is part of the theme. In the background are her servants with her chest. They have her clothing draped over her shoulders. They're either getting it for her to put on or taking it to stow, but this only emphasizes the fact that she's nude. Her clothes are there, but she is not wearing them. This is complicated by the fact that the picture was actually commissioned by the Duke of Urbino, Duke Guidobaldo II of Urbino. Paid for this from Titian, and it's now housed in a gallery, the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, and their website says that this was in fact a gift from Duke Guidobaldo II to his young wife, and that it was meant as an allegory of marriage. That seems a bit odd to us, but what they said basically was that the point of Venus, a heavily eroticized Venus, was meant as a way of instructing the young bride on how to balance her erotic life as the wife of Guidobaldo with the idea of faithfulness. The cute little dog at her feet is a symbol of faithfulness. This same metaphor of the dog has been used to argue that this picture is a prostitute because the symbol of faithfulness is asleep. So again, Titian's works, on a certain level, are somewhat poetic in that they, like poetry, give us multiple possibilities for meaning without actually spelling it out for us in a firm and unitary way. Multiple meanings exist within these, overlapping with each other. Our last work by Titian, and the last work for this part of the makeup lecture, is this image in the National Gallery, also of Venus with a mirror. This one is significantly more modest than the one in your textbook. She knows that she makes every attempt to cover herself up, not entirely successfully, because, of course, you, the viewer, getting this opportunity to see her nakedness is certainly part of the theme. The pose that she takes as she covers up one breast, her right arm coming across her midsection, is in fact derived from ancient statues of Venus, a very well-known type, the modest Venus type. We've seen statues of this type in class already, picked up by numerous artists. Botticelli, for example, uses the modest Venus type for his Birth of Venus picture that we looked at earlier. Titian is now using that same Venus type for his image as well. She's depicted in her dressing room, her toilette, getting ready to go out. She's making herself up, she's putting jewels in her hair, makeup on her face, getting dressed properly, making herself beautiful. And in the background we have a small Cupid-like figure who's crowning her with a wreath of flowers, crowning her achievement, helping her with her beauty, just as those pearls in her ears and her hair are doing the same. On the right, Cupid himself, you can see the quiver between his feet with the arrows there, is holding up a mirror so she can see her success at making herself beautiful. At the same time, of course, it's you that is supposed to make that judgment. Her body is turned towards you so you can see her beauty. And as we look at her in the mirror, what's interesting with the angle of the mirror is the way in which, in fact, she more or less looks out at you as well. She sees you looking at her, and she approves of this. The goddess of love is there for us to view. Well, that's the end of our talk on Renaissance art in general and Venetian Renaissance as well, to make up for the